presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
What I really like about writing is not knowing where it's going, and when the characters come alive enough that they do things that surprise me.
Coming up, I talk with author Pete Fromm about his latest work, A Job You Mostly Won't Know How to Do. And we take a look back at his memoir about the 7 months he spent in the Idaho wilderness. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. My guest today is probably best known for his coming-of-age memoir, Indian Creek Chronicles. In it, Pete Fromm recounts the adventures he had during the 7 months he spent in the Idaho wilderness guarding salmon eggs. More on that in a moment. In the 25 years since he published his memoir, Mr. Fromm has gone on to imagine the lives of others in 5 novels and 5 collections of short stories. And in 2017, he updated his Indian Creek memoir with The Names of the Stars. A resident of Montana, Fromm is the 5-time winner of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Literary Award. He's also seen 2 of his books turned into movies, including As Cool as I Am, which starred Claire Danes. Now, Fromm's newest novel is called A Job You Mostly Won't Know How to Do. It follows the life of Taz, a young father whose wife dies in childbirth. Taz must then raise their daughter by himself. And as with many of Fromm's works, Idaho makes an appearance. Now, Mr. Fromm is in Boise for an event at the Rediscovered Bookshop and has also stopped by the Dialogue set for a chat. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I don't need to invite or welcome you back to Idaho because Idaho really has played a big role in your life, in your heart, in your mind, in your works.
Right. It's ever since Indian Creek, when I spent 7 months on the Selway River. I keep coming back. We're just driving through the state yesterday. We forget how great Idaho is and beautiful. You know, Montanans tend to think that they're the top of the world, like Alaskans, like everybody out here. But it's such a beautiful place.
Where would you say it ranks in your life? I mean, what, as a character, if you will, what is Idaho to you?
Leaping completely unprepared into the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness for a winter alone changed everything that came after. So Idaho's changed me completely.
Well, before we talk about your newest work, let's talk about what you did, because I think people probably are familiar with Indian Creek Chronicles, or at least the name of it. I certainly was. You were hired to spend these months, most of which were in the winter, guarding or watching over, nurturing salmon eggs. Tell people why that was.
Well, the Idaho Fish and Game was trying to get salmon runs going back up from the Pacific all the way into the Selway.
And we should say this is 1978 we're talking about, 78,
right.
79.
Right, and they had constructed a channel, a diversion from Indian Creek into the Selway that they filled with river rock, put in 2.5 million salmon eggs, and they'd been doing the project without someone watching it, and they found that there was a lot of winter kill, mostly from the eggs freezing. And at the end of the channel there was a drop off, a little waterfall, and once it was 10 below, 20 below, that would start to freeze solid at night, which would cause the whole channel to back up and freeze solid and kill everything in it. So they needed a person to chop the ice off the end of the channel every morning. And that was my career as a babysitter of salmon eggs. Took about 5 minutes a day.
The rest of the time you were meeting yourself in a way, because
right.
It was so quiet and you had to figure out how to feed yourself, and then you were meeting characters back there, which is a really interesting part of the book.
Yeah, the lion hunters came in January and February. I'd see a few every week or so, but there was this weird kid back there by himself, so they were intrigued and they'd invite me along. And then in the spring, once they opened the road for the river trips and bear hunters, the bear hunters seemed to all find out that there's this guy who spent the winter there. They would stop at my tent and want to talk about the winter, but by then I'd been in there for 6 months, and I really had gotten used to being by myself, and I didn't want to tell people what my winter was like. So I'd see them coming, and I just slip back into the woods and dodge them.
Now, I know on this trip you spoke to the Selway Bitterroot Foundation.
Right.
And that there were young people there listening to you as well, and you encouraged them to think about doing something like this themselves and not worry too much about, not being totally prepared.
Right. The kids are so capable of so much more than they know they are because they're so rarely tested. And just raising my own sons, the difference between, I grew up in a big family and we sort of just set loose. Just because of time, when parents didn't have time to watch all of us, and now the protection is so much more careful and ever present, and so the kids don't dare a lot, and they read this book in their class, and they just thought it was so funny that somebody would do something that they didn't know anything about, but then they also became intrigued. Oh, that'd be so cool because you'd learn everything so fast, and so I was pushing them to, you know a lot more than you know, you're capable of a lot more than you ever dreamed you were.
Your cell phones won't work back there, but you'll be okay.
Right. And I've talked to a lot of schools, and one of the most depressing things is 20 years ago, students would say, oh yeah, I really that would be so cool to do that. And now it's almost nobody because they can't imagine being out of service for half a year.
Now, you went back, maybe 25 years after you had done this in 1978, you went into the Barb Marshall Wilderness and had been asked again to do a similar project.
Right.
And that book, which I recommend people take a look at, is called The Names of the Stars.
Right.
And by then you had two children, two boys of your own, and so it's a very different experience.
Right.
Your life had changed so dramatically that in some ways it was harder to be in there
very much
than
so.
when you were
right.
worrying about what to eat because you wanted to get back to your family.
Yeah, I thought my boys would be able to come with me. They were 6 and 9. My wife thought better of it. She was perfectly happy sending me into the grizzlies' den, but not the boys. And it was by far the right way to go. It would have been terrifying to be back there with them, because the bears were just out and they were following the elk and eating the calves, and I ran into them constantly.
Let's talk about your newest work, A Job You Mostly Won't Know How to Do. I have to look down when I read that. It's a little bit difficult title.
The most difficult title in the planet. You did a good job.
It's about a man who all of a sudden becomes a single parent, a sole parent, because his wife dies in childbirth. And we don't think about that happening, but it does still happen. I looked up the data. It's increasing. Maternal deaths are increasing in the 40 plus age of women, but they're not declining in the other ages either, which
right.
they are in other parts of the world. So this is
the U.S. is leading in maternal deaths of all industrial countries.
So this happens. This is a reality, and in this instance, this young father has to figure out what to do. And it's not like he works in a stockbrokerage. He's a carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand this theme came to you after reading a short story.
Yes, a student, I teach at the Pacific University's MFA program in Oregon, and a student in that program slapped me in the chest with this book, and the literary magazine, Glimmer Train, and said, read The Hospital in this and tell me if I'm a baby for crying. And
it was a man.
Yes, and it's about a woman who's in a high-risk pregnancy, and she's in the hospital for quite a while, and her parents come in, and it's told from the husband's point of view, and eventually she dies, and the baby is born and survives, and the story ends with the hospital doors opening up and him about to take his step out into the world with this baby. And it was a perfect ending for this short story. But I thought, wow, but he's got to step through that door. And that's the opening of a much bigger story. And the next day I sat down to start with the Taz walking into his home with this baby and not his wife. And how's he going to move forward from there?
In order to flesh the story out, so to speak, did you draw on your own experiences as a dad? Did you talk to other men who had to do this on their own? How did you fill out the details?
No, I didn't talk to anyone who lived through that situation. Sometimes in cases like that where the situation's so dramatic, if you do talk to somebody, you tend to take their story as the way it has to be. And so I try to avoid that. But yes, I raised 2 boys, not alone, but I was a stay-at-home father. Our oldest son didn't sleep for years. And so the scenes of Taz up with this child night after night after night, they were not a problem to write. I'd been there. And then the rest of it was just trying to figure, not what would I do, but this guy, what would somebody in his position, how does he react?
He seems relatively calm to me, actually. That's one thing I noticed throughout the book. Maybe he stuffs it, his emotions down.
Yeah, I think
but he
first it's even a state of shock.
Pretty taciturn about it all. He's
stunned and unknowing, but can't do anything drastic because he's got this baby to take care of. So the baby chains him down, but also keeps him from going wild or just losing it completely. He's got to be there for the child.
And as I think with your short stories in particular, this is also a relational story. It's about relations. It's about community, right? And so he's not really alone. He feels as if he's alone, but there are other people that come to his aid, and that's really that's how it happens, in life too, right?
Right. I'm so glad you said that, because when I started to write the novel after reading that story, I was positive I'm going to write a story about a guy raising a baby alone. And I started the first scene at that time was the first scene of him bringing the baby, putting it down on the floor in the car seat in the living room, and just walking out of the room as the baby started to cry, and staring out the back window, wondering how does he move on from here? And the baby's crying gets louder and louder, and finally it stops. And I was at that point thinking, I don't know what happened, why it stopped crying, but that's going to be what triggers him, and he's going to turn to run back to the baby. And it turns out it's his best friend standing in the door holding the baby, saying, we probably have to figure out how to feed this thing. And I realized nobody's that alone. And there is, but up to that moment, I thought, this is this guy alone with this baby. And as soon as his friend Rudy showed up, well, no, and his mother-in-law is going to be there. She'd come out for the birth, and so she's in the next scene. And so it really was an eye-opener to me, like sort of a eye-opener that, well, yeah, you're not alone unless you're raising salmon eggs. And that
even there, then you had occasional visitor, or you weren't alone because you had animals. I mean, you had wildlife around you.
Right,
so.
and a dog.
Right.
And,
I know the dog was really, I love that dog.
But this did become the story of, I hate that expression, but the village that it takes to not only raise the child, but to pull him back into the world.
Right. Did you find yourself becoming emotional as you wrote it?
Yeah, the last thing.
Or as emotional as
I've been asked. People say, "Oh, you made me cry," and that's writing's the only, I hope, the only profession where that's good news. And I've also been asked, "So do you get choked up?" And the last thing you want to say is, I'm so good, I make myself cry, but. Yeah, there are scenes in there that were tough to write, and even rereading them and working through them again and again. I take it as a good sign that, wow, that kind of hit me.
Your short stories, which I've also enjoyed, often end as short stories, sometimes do, with not a conclusive ending, a question for readers to figure out. This is a little bit more, tied up at the end. Was that intentional, that you wanted to end the story with people knowing what happens?
No, I resisted that. I really thought, a student of mine just today she was writing about another book, said something about how what she admired about the book's ending was that they didn't all live happily ever after, but they lived hopefully. And I thought that was such a good way to put it, that I always want to leave some ray of hope. Sometimes I can't. I've written stories where this doesn't work out for anybody. And but in previous novels, I've tried to. I'm always hopeful for the characters. I work with them with years, and so I like them, and I want things to work out. And in this story, the way the ending came, it really suddenly, after many drafts, I said, if I leave it open, it's going to feel more artificial than if it starts to come into a close. And I fought it for a long time and just thought, no, this is the way it's going.
You mentioned that at first your story was going to be about how Taz raises the baby by himself, but then something happened as you were writing it, and you realized that the character turned around and saw his best friend there to help. Is that part of the writing process generally for you, that you allow the story to come through you and the characters, and you
completely
remain open to what can happen?
I hear about writers who outline meticulously and know where they're going the whole time, and to me that just sounds like work. It's like, okay, today I'm going from A to B, but what I really like about writing is not knowing where it's going, and when the characters come alive enough that they do things that surprise me, or say something that was completely unexpected to me, and that usually shows, wow, it's working now. And there were things in the story that I fought to not let happen, because it wasn't my impression of where the story was going. And then, well, the way the people in the story worked, that's where they took it. And
so your wife is probably used to you kind of mumbling and talking to.
She's very patient.
Unseen.
Yeah, sometimes some of the novels have had some pretty acidic wit, and I've said things to her that she just goes, "Oh, that was Maddie, wasn't it?" And you just can't help it. You're into that mode of dialogue and the sharp attack, and yeah, she just calls it, you're in the writer place.
Yeah, I was looking back, actually. Richard Ford, who has a story called Great Falls, which is where you're from, in 2007, in an interview, he said, there is one guy out there named Pete Fromm, who's a pretty good short story writer who lives in Great Falls.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Pretty good short story writer.
Yeah, I wouldn't forget that for quite a while.
Yeah, that's a nice...
Yeah, from Richard, that's pretty good.
On balance, do you prefer writing novels and being able to flesh out a story, or do you gravitate to the short stories?
For decades, I wrote short stories, exclusively. And the way short stories sell, the publishers want you to write a novel.
Oh, really?
And they're like, okay, we'll buy a collection if you can give us a novel. And novels are much more frightening to start, because you don't know how long you're going to be in there, or if they'll ever, if you can flip the switch and say it's alive. But I really enjoy spending years with a group of people rather than a month, and then losing those people and having to come up with somebody else. So it's been novels.
we started this interview by talking about Indian Creek Chronicles, which, as I mentioned, many people may know you best from that. Does that hang over you? Is it an asset, or is it a problem that?
That's a great question. I think of the Stones having to play Satisfaction every time they go anywhere, and Indian Creek is by far the best known book, particularly in the U.S. And I've often had people say, "Oh, I didn't know you wrote anything else." And it was published in France 12 years ago, and in the French market, they're fascinated with the U.S. West and kind of the myth of it. And the difference over there is if they hook onto a writer, they want to read everything. And A Job You Mostly Won't Know How to Do came out in France yesterday and is a bestseller. They just they'll follow everything. And in the U.S., there's much more. Oh, we like the nonfiction books, but those novels are about different stuff, and we're not interested. And I've been told over and over that the reason they're so enchanted with it is in France we have no wilderness. And
Wilderness.
And so when my French publisher brought his family over to the U.S. for the first time, he landed in Seattle and rented a car and drove to Missoula to give them an idea of the scale. But I took them back to Indian Creek, and their sons were 6 and 9 or 10 at the time. And it was so cool to see. I mean, you could have put Disneyland down the street and they never would have turned to look at it. To just have this huge place to be wild in. And we went to this giant rock over a swimming hole, and I said, "Okay, guys, now what we do here is we run off the rock and jump in the river." And they just looked at their parents like, "He's not real. Is he serious?"
Some American kids now might do that too.
My kids went streaking by and launched, and we couldn't get them to stop.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've heard about people actually coming to, say, the Sawtooth or some of the areas we have here and being in tears because they don't have that.
Right.
And they really appreciate it.
Right, and they're very good. You always ask there, are you still protecting it? Is it still going to be that way? But I will never complain about Indian Creek's success. I mean, I talked about it last night, and it's fun to see people so intrigued by something that happened 40 years ago, and it sort of keeps it alive for me too, and especially with the high school kids coming in and being so jazzed about that story and wanting to ask you questions and being kind enough not to say, "Oh, I didn't think you'd be so old," but it's sort of a story that people who come out west can really relate to because they feel like they don't know enough. And instead of trying to play the mountain man who knows everything, to admit that I didn't know anything, it just puts people in a place where they can go into that story and go, "That's how I would have been." And that's always fun to see.
Do you already have characters in your mind for your next work, or are you focusing on doing the book tour for this?
I've got them in mind. I've got a couple guys and a situation.
A couple guys in a situation or and a situation?
And a situation.
A couple guys and a situation,
right.
Okay.
And there may be a baby in there, I'm not sure.
There may be a baby.
But
some women too?
Yep, a daughter, an ex-wife, and I think I've got enough to where I'm going to be in France for the next month, and then come back and have nothing scheduled for the foreseeable future, and really be able to dive into these. Because there's always a risk of dying of neglect if I go away from something for too long. I go back to it and it just doesn't have whatever the drive was to discover more.
Well, here, write it down.
That's what I'll be jotting notes on the trains.
Or you can record it or something like that.
I've done that before too.
Well,
I think I've got a good foothold in this one.
have fun in France. I mean, what's not to like? French food, French wine, French or whatever. The landscape, the people.
Yeah,
I mean,
passionate readers. It's so much fun.
Really, really interesting. Très intéressant.
Oui, oui.
That's about it right now for me. But
That's 12 years. That's what I've learned.
well, it was a pleasure to be able to talk with you.
The pleasure's mine.
And I look forward to seeing what the two men in the situation is.
Well, I'll let you know. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have. You've been listening to author Pete Fromm. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.